enormous pleasure to be able to introduce Gautam Modi to the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly. Exactly a year ago this month, I was lucky enough to be in India and visited Gautam in his offices as Secretary of the New Trade Union Initiative. We had met a number of years previously at a historical materialism conference in London. And I knew a little bit about the NTUI, and the opportunity to meet with Gautam and his activists was really eye-opening and extremely exciting in a context where we're all aware of how different a trade unionism we're going to have to develop in order to get past these series of very serious defeats that we've suffered in recent decades. I must say that the first question that was raised in the offices of the NTUI was, tell us about the revolutionary developments in Toronto that we read about on the Socialist Project bulletin. And they read the bulletin very carefully, and they knew all about the Assembly insofar as you can know all about it from reading the bulletin. I must say as well that what I heard from them puts us in every way to shame. In no way to denigrate what we're doing, but the remarkable creativity and successes, whatever the limitations they face, of the NTUI has really been remarkable, absolutely fantastic. They recently had organized, we'll hear about this in Gautam, 20,000 women in Chennai working for Nokia. Gautam was telling me they've organized 30,000 sex trade workers in Calcutta. They have 36 women organizers in Chennai alone. We're working for and with the union. We have a great deal to learn from what the NTUI is doing, not least because it has a commitment to taking in individual members. With the union, the merger between the CW and the CP and the CAW being founded on taking individual members as one of the things they're going to try to do, we can learn a lot from the NTUI about how that can be something that is actually productive and creative and capacity building for the labor movement, which one hopes it will be here as it is there. So without any further ado, let me introduce Gautam, and I look forward to learning from him as I have before.
I'd like to start by thanking the editors of the Socialist Register who made it possible for me to be here. There's a possibility that what I write will be in the next volume of the Socialist Register, and I'd urge you to buy copies of it so that you have more talks like this. Well, I'd also like to thank the Assembly for inviting me, and thank you all for coming out here this Sunday afternoon.
Gautam, can you speak up just a minute? Air conditioning.
Defending, the idea of new trade unionism is always a tough task, and even more tough after Leo's introduction. Because I think new trade unionism has as much of the old in it as it seeks to find the new. And I think if we have to teach, we have to learn too, and I'm here also to learn this afternoon, because that's the only way. Unless we learn from each other, there's no other way we can build a united movement, not just in our own countries, but across continents. There's, little doubt that the condition of the working class, both in economic terms and political terms, has never been worse in living memory. And this would hold true for every country on this planet. We've seen in the last 20 or 30 years an attack on our wages. We've seen an attack on our social security. We've seen an attack on working conditions and tenure. And most of all, we've seen an attack on our right to join and form unions. And despite this, we're of course divided across countries, but we're also divided within our own countries. We're divided by gender, we're divided by race and religion, and in the case of my country, by caste. But we're also divided by sections within the working class of regular, irregular, casual, tenure, illegal. And while it's the task of capital to divide us, we have in the trade union, and again from country to country, we have in the trade union come somehow to believe in those divisions. We've come somehow to understand that there is a division between the regular and irregular. And that, in some sense, comes with our inability to quite completely engage with capital, to sort of recognize how central not just the regular but the irregular are to the capitalist project, and how much more central they have been in the last 2 decades to capital accumulation, which is really, I think, in a sense, limited the way we think and we approach the question of unity. We seek, after a fashion, and all of us do who come from the trade union movement, to unionize in numbers. That's very important to build union power. But what we also need to do is we need to unionize all sections of the working class, because without that, we're not going to be able to meaningfully unite the working class. And if we talk about union power, it's going to have to be a convergence of all those sections that would really help us build union power. When I began my union work 20 years ago this month, I cut my teeth in a metalworkers union that unionized on one single site in Mumbai city, where there were 20,000 workers, all unionized, all regular. And the comrade who mentored me in the NTUI, who's now president and will stand down as president of the NTUI in November, told the story of when he first showed up at that site in his early 20s, in the early 1950s. There were roughly 2,000 workers on that site, and there were perhaps not 200 who were regular. And over the next 10 years, he led a struggle that regularized 10,000 workers on that site. That union still survives. There's a shopping mall that stands on the site where I started work 20 years ago. We have upwards of 40,000 workers, members in that union, but only 2,000 of them are regular today. So, I mean, you know, our histories are common, and I think we need to recognize them. And I mean, that 2,000 is going to fall. I mean, I remember seeing in December, looking at the numbers, 175 of our regular members are going to retire in the course of this calendar year. And we know we're not going to win 175 regular jobs. When I came to this hall, I asked, you know, how come there's a union hall in downtown, in the center of town? There has to be a history to it. And I was told that this was a union hall that originally belonged to textile workers. And I think that's also the history we share. If you find a union hall anywhere in the center of town, in any old industrial city, it could be Toronto, it could be Bombay, it's going to have begun with textile workers. There are no textile workers over here. And textile workers, for the most part, where your cotton is spun, are outside the pale, so to speak. And what I think I want to spend the next 15 or 20 minutes about is really talking about how we look at the divide between regular and irregular, and how it's very much part of our thinking processes, which in a way stands between us and unionizing irregular workers. When my comrades went out in the early 1980s, they started in 1979 to unionize construction workers. They told themselves after a few weeks of organizing, you can't organize them. they do not have an employer-employee relationship. They don't have regular employment. Many of them are petty contractors. They don't even draw a wage. They work for hundreds of small contractors. They don't show up for work every day. Some of them fell by the wayside, others carried on. And they built a construction workers union in one state, in the state of Tamil Nadu, of 120,000 members over some 10 or 15 years. They set the bar, as it were, of understanding what is not an employer-employee relationship. They learned how to organize on town squares and street corners. They learned how to regulate the wage on town squares and street corners. In a sense, they taught us some of the early lessons of how to organize outside the factory, outside a workplace. They were flag bearers of what became the national legislation for construction workers. But what's more important is they became flag bearers for a national struggle for irregular workers to have employment regulated, where they don't necessarily have employment with one employer throughout the year, or certainly not throughout a lifetime. But they did something else, which we haven't really worked on, but it's still something that's in us and we need to get to the bottom of. Construction workers, like most sectors of employment that have a small cluster of very large corporations but a very large number of small employers, and that's the case everywhere else in the world where there's housing repair, there's a plumber working in somebody's bathroom. That construction workers, eventually, if you actually map their working lives, work for only a small set of employers. They may not work for the one employer, but they actually, if you map a working life, they work for 3, 4, 5, 6 contractors, not a different contractor every day and 500 contractors in a working life. So there are relationships, but we don't really get to the bottom of these relationships unless we get out there and organize them. But of course, no organizing effort is perfect, and nor were the construction workers. In 2001, 2002, 2003, they realized that their union, very strong in an entire state, a province in Canada, had very few women members. And that women didn't join their union because it's the male workers who had the skills. And women really only got jobs as head loaders, carrying bricks on construction site, carrying cement on construction site. So the union put a skill training program to train women workers into skills of masonry, carpentry. And when they got trained and they went out to the construction sites to get work, the members of the union prevented them from getting jobs. In 2005, the women workers left the union and formed a women workers union. When they formed that union, an old comrade said, "That union should be dissolved tonight. We're dividing the working class on gender lines." But the construction workers union fortunately had a mature section of leadership which said no, they've actually come out of a genuine organic struggle against patriarchy within our own union, and let them be. And so they were, and what they discovered was something even more complicated than just the lack of an employer-employee relationship that comrades talked about in 1979. They discovered that women workers, for the most part, are not just construction workers, but they're also domestic workers. They are also sometimes garment workers. And as industrial investment expanded, some of them went into electronics, many of their daughters went into electronics. So not just were we looking at union members who didn't have a consistent employer, we were also looking at union members who performed different, who worked in different industries in the course of a month and certainly in the course of a year. So when the European summer is to rise, in the spring, so to speak, there's not much spring in Chennai, but in the spring, garment factories are dishing out larger number of shirts. And so there are more jobs in the garment factories. And when that scales down, those very women go and work in people's houses, in upper middle class houses. We learned a third thing through the emergence of that group of women. And that was, we can organize garment workers in garment factories, we can organize electronics workers in electronic factories, but we can't, just like in here, and I've been hearing for 2 days, and Sam has been talking to me about it, home caregivers or domestic workers, we can't organize them at their workplace. We can't ring doorbells of upper middle class and upper class homes. We certainly can't ring them in the hundreds and thousands, but we can't even enter those areas. And so what they learned was they needed to organize at home, they needed to organize in the slum, they needed to organize in the shantytown. Of course, there are, I mean, you know, this is not to say that this is a unique experience or a unique experiment. We did this 100 years ago, perhaps in this town, when women went, and I kept wondering that name, Spinda, is that it?
Spadina.
Spadina. Sounds very familiar. And then somebody said, you know, the textile company is Spadina. And I'm sure in this town, in the 20s and 30s, in the working class ghettos, there were comrades trawling those alleyways, organizing workers. I mean, you know, new unionism is not new. New unionism is regenerating ourselves from what we learned in the last century. It's not something we bring from some other planet and sort of try and plant it over here. It's really about how we built the union first, how our forebears built the movement. And I think that's in a sense very, very crucial to how we see you know, expanding and growing the movement. And I think when we go back to organizing in the community, it throws up other challenges. It throws up not just the challenge of the wage, but the entire complexity of the social wage, of housing, of childcare, of the double burden of women workers, of the quality of and access to healthcare, and even schooling. These are all issues I think we need to address within our movements. We don't address them sufficiently. Yesterday over dinner, somebody asked me, when you organize sex workers, who do you negotiate with? You don't really negotiate when you organize sex workers. When you organize sex workers, you fight, and you fight with the police. You fight with the police to ensure that there's no criminalization of sex work. You fight with local health authorities to ensure that they get special benefits and special access to retroviral drugs at affordable prices. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I still enjoy sitting around the comfort of a boardroom negotiating in a global firm. There's nothing more pleasurable than that, because there's nothing more pleasurable than contesting capital at its height, at its most organized form. It teaches you more than anything else teaches you. But the fact is, we're negotiating less and less, and we're signing fewer and fewer agreements. And the vast swath of the working class is outside the pale of those boardroom, those negotiations in those boardrooms, and wage settlements. In 2006, when the comrades in Chennai went out to organize domestic workers, I said to them, no, with 10% industrial growth, you know, there are going to be no domestic workers left. You're wasting your time. I said this myself. I didn't realize that with 5 years of 7 or 8% GDP growth, India would throw up a middle class that would actually would employ domestic workers in larger numbers than anybody ever estimated. That's the largest growing section of the workforce. I mean, it's suggested that perhaps 5% of the Indian workforce today actually engages, and almost entirely women, engages in domestic work. And I said to my comrades, organize garments and try and organize electronics. I mean, I too am bred in an old vanguardist tradition, and I really thought they were wasting their time. And we had arguments, and I just sort of gave up. I mean, I don't organize in Chennai, and we just gave up. I just gave up and said, okay, let them do what they want. They'll get a knock in their teeth, and then they will come back and say, you were right. They were right. And I think if I think that what new unionism is, I think that is new unionism. To actually hear voices on the ground and not to try and overload that with what we think is what reality should be. I mean, to me, that's a lesson, and this is a story I like to tell because I think this is something that I learned for myself. In a country as complicated in India, but there are complexities elsewhere, and I'm sure there are similar complexities, not perhaps with agricultural land, but with old housing estates being mowed down into shopping plazas and shopping malls. In 2007, and some of you probably know a global firm today called Tata Motors, which makes the world's smallest car or cheapest car for, I don't know, $2,000 or $2,500. They went out to set up their car plant in the middle of a field in the eastern Indian state of West Bengal. They met with huge resistance from all manner of farmer interests, but they also met with resistance from agricultural workers who were unionized by an affiliate of the NTUI. And so that affiliate said, the NTUI has to stand up for us. You have to stand up against this plant. And we did. Only to realize a day after we put the statement out, and we thought we had a reasonable consensus. A small group of auto workers amongst us, in the old truck plants in the country, said, the Tata Nano is about economic development. We're auto workers. We can't oppose a car plant. We have a small membership in Tata Motors. And they said, we work for Tata Motors. We want to see Tata Motors profit. We want to see it grow. Our kids will get jobs in there. That was a tough call, because here was a section of the membership, and I dare say the most advanced membership, very critical also for sustaining the organization financially, which was saying you're not representing our interests. And so we had a debate in the organization. It took us some weeks to get around it, and we evolved an idea of what we termed democratic industrialization. That we weren't opposed to industrialization, but we were certainly not for industrialization in a vulgar utilitarian sense, where we could sit down at a table and count how many agricultural jobs lost and how many quality industrial jobs created, so on and so forth. Because the structure of the economy is such, with more than half the workforce locked into the countryside, that we do as a national organization need to represent all interests. And we need to represent interests of rural workers too, however small a number in which they may be organized. And this was a debate that went down to the shop floor and the factory gates of every old shop we organize in and every old factory we organize in. And 6 months down the road from when the first call came saying that this position of the organization was undemocratic, the truck workers wanted the leader for the Agricultural Workers Union from West Bengal to be the guest at their May Day rally. And so that was sort of, a real movement within the organization coming to recognize that the rights of truck workers would not be undermined if agricultural workers stood up and fought for their livelihood. And we could actually find a point of unity, we could find a point of convergence. In 4 or 5 years ago, when the women workers in Chennai started organizing garments, garment workers or garment factories, they were organizing outside a special economic zone, so you don't get to go inside a special economic zone. Only employees with entry passes can go into special economic zones. So union organizers can't go in there. So you really need to build a caucus outside, and that's really where organizing outside the workplace begins to matter, to be able to get in there and organize, because you need a band of militants who grow outside before they can go in and start sort of lighting the fire there, so to speak. And there was an industrial accident in which a woman worker got killed. And the union decided to hold a protest outside the special economic zone. And by then we'd formed the NTUI, so they called out upon all affiliates around that town to join in there. And from the engineering and metal factories around there, our membership sent men in 2s and 3s, mostly in their 40s and 50s. And the scene outside that special economic zone was several hundred women workers, a small number of men who were there in solidarity, and 30 or 40 managers of the garment factories with digital cameras trying to shoot as many of the women's faces as they could, so that the next day they could pull those photographs out and says, pull out of the union or you're out. The men comrades sort of stood and watched, and the women said, we're not going to have those photographs taken. What they didn't realize is that there was a cover of the police behind the scenes. And the moment they turned to the managers, there was the police. The fact is that the men comrades still stood, because many of them had never been in a battle ever. If you're 40 and you got a tenured job 20 years ago, there hasn't been a serious strike. There's been no serious industrial action. You've moved from one pay agreement to the next. We've lost tenured jobs, but those of us who have tenured jobs still have them. My sense is that that scene of young women taking on the managers and the cops was, in a sense, a turning point for the comrades from old industry. I mean, before the skirmish began, I remember one of them saying to me, comrade, what do we have in common with them? They're fighting for the minimum wage. We take home 5 times the minimum wage. The same comrade said to me 13 months ago, on the eve of our annual conference, he said, comrade, what we have to do is we have to come to a decision to build a national struggle in the minimum wage. And I think that, in a sense, has been, if Leo says success, I think that has been the success. And I think the success has been that we were able to pick up the idea of the worst off worker and be able to translate the need to struggle for the worst off worker as part of the struggle for the best off worker. That comrade understood very clearly that if the garment factory workers didn't get the minimum wage, his daughter wouldn't get a minimum wage too. But more still, I think he also recognized that if workers didn't get the minimum wage and other workers didn't get the minimum wage and more than the minimum wage, his 5 times the minimum wage was under threat. It was permanently under threat. And if we talk about insecurity, and I think every tenured worker today faces that insecurity anywhere in the world, is the insecurity that I will lose my job tomorrow, if not at the end of the shift today. And that's because there are a significant number of workers who've been pushed into a situation that they're willing to offer themselves for much less. And often when irregulars come in to a factory and they don't join the union, we call them blacklegs, we call them management agents. We say, oh, they've been hired by contractors who are close to the management, they're close to the contractor. Maybe they are, but they are because they're desperate. And I think it's that desperation we need to put our finger on. And this is not sort of, I think, a lesson we learn just in the 20th century. Sorry, in the 21st century. This is a lesson we actually learned in the 20th century. This is a lesson my mentor, Comrade Tangappan, learned in the 1960s. This is a lesson we learned when we organized the auto factories in this continent in the 1930s, when the union reached out to every worker, from the highest skilled engineer to the janitor. And in the years after the Second World War, both here and in countries like India, we fought for equal pay for them. We fought for equal working employment conditions for them. In the 70s, in many sites, even with declining union power, when productivity pay was enforced, we ensured that those who ran our industrial canteens and those who cleaned our toilets also got productivity pay if we had to concede productivity pay, and it was not just the productive workers who got productivity pay. But in the 80s and 90s, when those jobs got outsourced to DHL and Compass and Sodexo and Group 4, we just let them go. And I think some part of the regeneration is we need to go back to the old framework of the General Workers' Union. I mean, I've spent a good part of my 20 years in the union movement arguing for Industrial Workers' Union, saying, look, in Europe they have Industrial Workers' Union, that's what gives them the power. But I think looking back at these 20 years and looking at what we've lost, I think in some ways, I think an important lesson of what we've lost through outsourcing cannot be won by just organizing workers under industrial lines, but by going back to the model of the General Workers' Union, of unionizing workplace by workplace, and when we can't get into that workplace, unionizing community by community and trying to get into as many workplaces as possible. But not just sort of being mechanical in that we just need to organize workplaces, because we're not going to be able to get into that many workplaces that easily. And as I said, I'd be just as happy as any other trade unionist to spend more time in boardrooms than, trawling the shanty towns of India. But I think we also need to recognize that our forebears didn't build unions to negotiate. Our forebears built unions as the organization that builds class consciousness. They built unions as the organization that built solidarity. And it's that it's class consciousness and solidarity which gave us union power, on the basis of which, after the Second World War, at many sites of employment, we won the union power to be able to negotiate. And I think we do need to ask ourselves, and I think this is the question that we ask ourselves in the NTUI every day, is we're not contractors, we're not negotiating contractors. And I think that's a very, very important, I think, struggle that we need to address organizationally. And there's always that moment where there's a divided loyalty between the endless and ongoing struggle of irregular workers, where you don't get to negotiate, you don't get to sign an agreement, and there is no gain. Some of the comrades, when we decided last January to launch a national minimum wage struggle, some comrades got up and said, so what are we going to achieve? Do we have a target? How many people will win the minimum wage? I think the struggle was more about raising the banner of the minimum wage, of getting as many of our members to go out there and fight for the minimum wage. Because the conception of the minimum wage imbues in it a notion of livelihood, of living standards, of civilization. And I think that's, as a first step, far more important in building class consciousness and building solidarity amongst different sections, including, and I'd repeat, including those who earn several times the minimum wage. I'm really sort of going to close with, with two or three things. And I've talked about successes, but let me just say this: the successes are far and few between. We have defeats which affect a much larger number of our members than the successes win benefits and gains. But I think that's the challenge we all face today. I think the regeneration involves our committing ourselves to the long haul. And it's really the long haul, if I can go back to saying, of building working class consciousness, of building a class conscious movement rather than a movement that caters to a small minority. And I think there are two things which, speaking on foreign shores, that I sort of think are sort of central. One is the notion of solidarity. I think our late 20th century unions also invoked a sense of solidarity, of national leaders becoming international, flying around to meetings on one or another side of the global divide, of the ICFTU and the WFTU, and really post-1991 of reducing ourselves to writing letters of solidarity as a form of the so-called united global trade union movement. And I think we need very hard to reflect on that. 7 or 8 months ago, we hosted a group of metal workers from Germany. They're not the official leadership of the IG Metall. They're the Linke caucus within the IG Metall. So they're shop floor leaders from Daimler, Skoda, and Volkswagen who came to India to spend time and understand the situation in Daimler, Skoda, and Volkswagen in India. And so they traveled the country, meeting their comrades in these plants, staying at their homes. And then we had, at the end of their 3 weeks, we had a two-day workshop with the workers or the shop floor leaders from plants of both countries. And one of the German comrades said, let's do an exercise. Let's start by going out of this room into 2 different groups, one German and one Indian. And let's come back after half an hour with a list of healthcare issues we suffer from. And I come from an old Southern tradition. And I thought to myself, oh, this is just dividing the world in north-south lines. I said, no, comrade, we should mix the groups. And he said, look, you do this workshop the way you want for the rest of the 2 days, but let me just do this. And so I let him go, more out of politeness than anything else. I just had no idea what he was trying to do there. When they came back into the room, so each group was to come back with the 10 most important health issues. They came back to the room with the top 7 common. in that order. I think probably there was a shuffling between number 6 and number 7. They came back, the number 1 problem that they all said was stress. They were all auto workers. Number 2 was back problems. And so on and so forth. But, you know, in that 1 hour, we brought together in very, very different environments of both unions and employment, German and Indian workers. And I think when we talk about solidarity, solidarity is going to have to mean more substantive mechanisms of building bridges between each other, more substantive bridges of trying to come together, and not sort of conferences of the global union federations you know, complex paraphernalia which sort of mirrors the international bureaucracy. I think this is also going to have to be part of our regeneration of sort of unbundling the infrastructure, the huge infrastructure that the trade unions have created around themselves. And I think second, but not I mean, you know, and that's, I think, elemental in that sense. I think second, we do need to recognize that if we're talking about a union that unites, then we are talking essentially also in support of a democratic society. And our unions are going to have to take the leadership in the struggle of democracy. It's not going to be sufficient to just win rights at the workplace. But if we recognize that the working class is divided by other divisions in society, then we do need to take leadership if we seek to unite the working class to address the democratic challenge. And we need to address that in every sense of what democracy means. Yes, in the workplace, but at home, but also in society and politics. Because whether it's racial minorities or it's oppressed castes in India, they mirror our division of labor and the hierarchy within it. And if we don't, as unions, stand up, then we're never going to achieve that unity. And that's why I'd say that that's an elemental part of, I think, what I would see as the regeneration, to be able to stand up for every aspect of democratic rights, be it the freedom of speech, be it the freedom of religion, be it the freedom of democratic rights. And I'm going to stop with one more example. And we need to fight, and I mean, you know, and democracy also involves fighting the laws that came in post 9/11 everywhere on this planet. If you go to a modern shop floor today, so one of the things, so this is, and I'll just take another couple of minutes to say this. After the events in Mumbai in 2008, those events, many of you will be familiar with the attack on the luxury hotels in Mumbai city in 2008. Government concluded that these were attacks that took place in private places. And so they put in place legislation that allowed owners of private places that had public access to put in an entire infrastructure for security, which not just involved entry X-rays and security guards, but unlimited rights to put CCTVs out there. And so whether it's Suzuki or it's Honda, these are also now private places with public access. So it's anti-terror law, so to speak, that's used today to watch workers, to see them hand-billing each other, to see them taking on the supervisor, to see them trying to form unions. It's all on CCTV. And in the case of employers like Suzuki, it goes down to how much time you spend when you go to piss, which is a matter of shop floor discipline today. So this is when when I say the democratic challenge, we've lost our rights in complex ways, but we've lost them nearly comprehensively. If we as an Indian trade union don't address what happens in Kashmir, if we as an Indian trade union do not address what happens across the border and how our government engages with Pakistan, we believe we're giving up that fight. Because we're not standing up. We're not standing up, and we're allowing a polity and a society to be divided along religious lines. And if they succeed, then that success will permeate into the working class too. And that's why we need to fight it. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.